The sea was calm that morning, deceptively calm. Beneath the shimmering surface of the Dardanelles, British and French warships waited, their steel hulls glistening in the pale light of dawn. Sailors whispered prayers, clutching letters from home. Officers stared into the haze, pretending not to notice the tremor in their hands. They were told this would be quick, a blow that would end the war. But as the first shells roared across the strait and the sky turned to fire, one truth became clear. The gates of hell had opened. What began as a bold gamble to end the Great War would become one of its greatest tragedies. A story of arrogance, courage, and unimaginable sacrifice. This is the story of Gallipoli. It began, as so many catastrophes do, with an idea that seemed brilliant on paper. By early 1915, the Great War had bogged down into a brutal stalemate. In the trenches of France and Belgium, millions of men faced death daily for a few yards of mud. Across Europe, leaders sought an escape from the deadlock. In London, one man believed he had found it. First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. At only 40 years old, Churchill was already a political giant. Eloquent, confident, and bursting with ambition. He saw himself as a man of destiny, a modern Marlborough, born to shape history. The plan he championed was daring, even visionary. If the Allies could force the Dardanelles, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, they could strike directly at the Ottoman Empire, Germany's weak ally. Capture Constantinople, Churchill argued, and the Ottomans would collapse. A new front would open, relieving pressure on the Russians and perhaps bringing neutral nations like Greece and Bulgaria into the Allied camp. It was a grand design, elegant, strategic, and seductive. But it would demand the cooperation of two forces that rarely work well together: politics and war. At first, it seemed that Churchill's energy might carry the day. In January 1915, the War Council approved his naval plan. A fleet of the Royal Navy's mightiest dreadnoughts, joined by French warships, would force their way through the Dardanelles. The Ottomans, it was believed, would crumble under such pressure. But from the beginning, cracks appeared. The Admiralty's senior commanders were skeptical. Admiral Fisher, Britain's greatest naval mind, warned that the plan was reckless, that old battleships, slow and vulnerable, were being sent into a death trap. He called it an adventure of despair. Still, Churchill pressed on. He believed in boldness, in momentum, in the will to act when others hesitated. And in February 1915, the guns of the Allied fleet opened fire on the Dardanelles. The thunder of naval artillery echoed across the Aegean. Shells rained upon the Ottoman forts guarding the straits. Kilid Bar, said El Bar, come Kale. For days, smoke blanketed the sea. Observers on distant islands saw only flashes of light and heard the endless roll of cannon fire. At first, it seemed to work. The outer forts were silenced. Churchill telegraphed London with optimism. The straits are within our grasp. But deep inside the narrow channels, the Ottomans had been preparing. Under the leadership of German General Lyman von Sanders and a young, ambitious officer named Mustafa Kemal, their defenses were being transformed. Rows of hidden artillery, minefields laid under moonlight, and soldiers ready to die where they stood. On March 18, 1915, the Allies made their grand assault. 18 battleships advanced in a line, the greatest fleet assembled since Trafalgar. The sea shook with their salvos. And then, one by one, the explosions began. A French battleship, Bouvet, struck a mine and capsized within minutes, taking 600 men to the depths. Then the British ships Irresistible and Ocean were hit, erupting into towers of flame. The Dardanelles had become a graveyard of steel. Admiral de Robeck ordered a retreat. Churchill, upon hearing the news, was stunned. He had believed in the power of courage and determination, but courage could not sweep away minds. The naval attack had failed, and now the only way forward was to land troops. That decision, made in desperation, would turn the Dardanelles from a failed naval campaign into a human tragedy on an unimaginable scale. In London, the War Council approved the creation of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, a coalition of British, French, Australian, and New Zealand troops. Many were young volunteers, filled with patriotic zeal, dreaming of glory on the battlefield. They sang songs on their transport ships as they sailed toward a name they could barely pronounce: Gallipoli. For Churchill, it was still a matter of pride and survival. His political reputation, his vision, his belief in himself all hung in the balance. He wrote later that he felt as if I were walking with destiny. But destiny at Gallipoli would prove merciless. April 25, 1915. Before dawn, thousands of soldiers climbed down into small landing boats. The water around them was glassy and dark. They whispered, laughed nervously, and checked their rifles. Ahead of them, cliffs loomed like shadows. On those cliffs, Turkish defenders waited, silent, invisible, patient. As the first light touched the horizon, an officer raised his whistle. It was the signal to go ashore. In the next moments, the beaches of Gallipoli would erupt into chaos. And for the men who landed that morning, there would be no glory, only death, confusion, and the realization that they had stepped into hell itself. The first boats touched the shore just as the eastern sky began to turn gray. The men of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Anzacs, had been told they would land on a broad, flat beach. Instead, they found themselves staring at steep cliffs and tangled scrub. The navigation had gone wrong. Currents had carried them north of their intended landing point. They were now trapped beneath towering ridges, facing an enemy that had the high ground. As the first oars struck the sand, the silence shattered. From above, flashes of rifle fire erupted. Bullets hissed through the air, cutting into flesh and wood. Men fell before they even set foot on land. The boats grounded in chaos, soldiers leaping into chest-deep water, rifles held above their heads, packs dragging them under. Some never resurfaced. Others crawled onto the beach, gasping, drenched in salt and blood. It was supposed to be a surprise attack, but the Turks were ready. From his command post overlooking the coast, Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal of the 19th Division had been expecting this moment. When reports came that enemy troops were landing north of Ari Bernu, he did not wait for orders. He gathered his men and marched them toward the sound of gunfire. When one of his officers asked what they should do if the enemy advanced, Kemal replied, "I do not order you to attack. I order you to die. In the time it takes us to die, other troops and commanders can come and take our place." That sentence would become legend. It captured the grim resolve of the Ottoman defense and the birth of a national hero. By mid-morning, the beach was a nightmare. The Anzacs were pinned down, unable to move forward or back. Shells burst among the rocks. The cries of the wounded echoed across the narrow cove. And yet, amid the horror, men showed courage beyond belief. Small groups clawed their way up the slopes, digging shallow trenches, firing at unseen enemies. They held on through the day, through heat and thirst, as the sea behind them turned red with blood. By nightfall, the cliffs above Anzac Cove were littered with the dead, and the living dug in where they could, too exhausted to move. They had come to capture the Dardanelles. Instead, they had gained just a few hundred meters of barren ground. To the south, at Cape Helles, British and French troops were facing the same fate. The beaches V, W, X, and Y were turned into killing fields. Machine guns mowed down entire waves of soldiers before they reached the shore. At V Beach, men of the Dublin and Munster Fusiliers approached inside a converted collier ship, the River Clyde. As the ramps dropped, the first men charged forward and were cut down instantly. Bodies piled up at the water's edge. The ship's captain, Edward Unwin, later won the Victoria Cross for trying again and again to free the jammed landing barges under constant fire. But courage could not overcome impossibility. The Turks, entrenched and determined, held the heights. For every meter gained, dozens of lives were lost. Within days, the beaches were choked with corpses. The smell of death mixed with the salt air. Flies swarmed over the trenches. The wounded lay in the sun, begging for water. Still, reinforcements kept coming: British, French, Indian, Senegalese, Gurkha, and Newfoundland troops. The campaign had become a multinational tragedy. By May, both sides had dug in. The Gallipoli Peninsula, just a few miles wide, was now a maze of trenches and barbed wire. The heat was suffocating, the stench unbearable. Water was scarce. Disease spread faster than bullets. Men lived among the dead, sometimes sleeping beside unburied corpses. Snipers picked off anyone careless enough to lift their head above the parapet. Each day brought shelling, thirst, and the endless sound of flies. A soldier of the 8th Battalion wrote in his diary, "The flies are everywhere. In our mouths are food, our wounds. The stench of dead men never leaves you. We are living in a graveyard." Churchill's vision of a decisive victory had turned into a stagnant nightmare. The beaches that were supposed to be gateways to Constantinople had become prisons. In London, the pressure mounted. Reports from Gallipoli were grim. Prime Minister Asquith faced criticism from Parliament, and public morale was faltering. The press began to question the wisdom of Churchill's folly. Even among his colleagues, support was collapsing. Admiral Fisher resigned in protest, declaring that he could no longer be part of such madness. The coalition government demanded accountability. By May 1915, Churchill was forced to resign from the Admiralty. He was shattered, his dreams of glory replaced by disgrace. He would later write, "I could see the long line of the dead stretching back to me, to my own office." For the men still on the peninsula, his resignation meant nothing. The shells continued to fall, and the dead continued to pile up. As summer came, the Allies made one last desperate attempt to break the stalemate. The August Offensive, a massive push involving fresh landings at Suvla Bay and renewed assaults at Anzac Cove. It began with high hopes. British commanders promised this would finally end the deadlock. Once again, troops waded ashore, and once again, chaos reigned. Poor coordination, lack of maps, and exhausted men doomed the plan from the start. At Suvla Bay, soldiers wandered in confusion under the blazing sun. Many ran out of water before they ever reached their objectives. Meanwhile, on the ridges above, Mustafa Kemal struck again. He rallied his troops personally, leading counterattacks that drove the invaders back. By August 10th, the offensive had collapsed. The cost was staggering. Tens of thousands lay dead or dying, and still the front lines barely moved. By the end of summer, the truth could no longer be ignored. Gallipoli was lost. But withdrawing would mean admitting failure and abandoning the dead. For months more, men endured the unendurable disease, frostbite, and despair. And when the end finally came, it would arrive not with glory, but with silence. By the autumn of 1915, Gallipoli had become a graveyard. The beaches that once echoed with the crash of waves and gunfire now reeked of death and rot. The heat of summer had given way to cold rain and mud. The trenches flooded. Rats thrived. Men shivered in their soaked uniforms, their boots rotting from their feet. Everywhere there was the same hollow look, the eyes of men who had seen too much. Letters home grew shorter, darker. "We no longer talk of victory," one soldier wrote. "We only talk of going home." Disease had claimed more lives than bullets. Typhoid, dysentery, frostbite, the enemies no one had expected. And yet, from London, orders still spoke of holding the line, as if there was still a line to hold. Behind the words, the truth was clear. The campaign had failed. By November, the British government could no longer ignore reality. A commission of inquiry, led by Lord Kitchener himself, traveled to the Dardanelles. When he saw the conditions, even the great war hero was shaken. The men were starving, the trenches collapsing, the morale gone. He realized the only victory left was survival. In December 1915, a decision was made, one that Churchill, now in political exile, would read about in silence. The Allied forces would evacuate Gallipoli. It was a bitter irony. After 8 months of blood and suffering, the only successful part of the entire campaign would be the retreat. The evacuation began under cover of night. No fanfare, no drums, no cheers, just silence and the soft crash of the sea. At Anzac Cove and Suvla Bay, soldiers packed their gear quietly, whispering to one another. Boots were wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. Empty tents were left standing to fool the enemy. Campfires were rigged with slow-burning devices to keep flickering long after the men were gone. Every step of the retreat was a masterpiece of deception. The engineers devised self-firing rifles, cans of water dripping onto triggers, to make it seem as if sentries were still at their posts. And it worked. Over 36,000 men slipped away under the noses of the Ottoman defenders without a single casualty. The final soldiers left in the early hours of January 9, 1916. When the last boats pulled from shore, the beaches lay empty, littered with debris, the ghosts of the fallen left behind. The toll of Gallipoli was staggering. Over 130,000 dead Turkish, British, Australian, New Zealand, French, and colonial troops, and more than 500,000 wounded. All for a few miles of barren, blood-soaked ground. For the British Empire, it was a wound to its pride and confidence. For Australia and New Zealand, it was something deeper. The Anzac legend was born from that defeat, a story of courage, endurance, and brotherhood. The young nations that had followed Britain into war began to see themselves as something separate, something new. Gallipoli, in tragedy, had helped forge their identity. For the Ottoman Empire, it was a rare and vital victory, one that breathed new life into a crumbling realm. And for Mustafa Kemal, the defense of Gallipoli made his name immortal. He would go on to lead his people to independence and become Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey. As for Churchill, the man whose ambition had set it all in motion, Gallipoli would haunt him for decades. He was driven from government, his reputation shattered. His friends abandoned him. For months he lived in despair, writing later, "I am finished." But the same stubborn will that had created the disaster would one day help redeem him. He joined the army and served on the Western Front as a lieutenant colonel, seeking, perhaps, a form of penance. Years later, he would return to politics, and when a new world war came, his voice would again call nations to fight. But in his private writings, Gallipoli never left him. He would call it the most terrible chapter of my life. Today, the Gallipoli Peninsula is quiet. The trenches are overgrown, the cliffs silent. Cemeteries line the ridges, white stones bearing names from every corner of the world. The sea below sparkles as it did on that first morning in April 1915. Every year on Anzac Day, thousands gather to remember. They read the words of Ataturk, written to the mothers of the fallen. You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons now lie in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well. It is perhaps the most human legacy of a war that was anything but human. The Gallipoli campaign was meant to be a shortcut to victory, a bold strike to change the course of history. Instead, it became a monument to the arrogance of men who believed they could bend war to their will. Yet even in failure there was courage. In defeat there was endurance. And in death there was the faint echo of something greater, the understanding that the cost of ambition, when paid in blood, is never forgotten. When the last ship vanished over the horizon, the sea was calm once more. But beneath its surface lay the ghosts of a generation, and the memory of Churchill's greatest mistake.